Hello and welcome to New Books Network. I'm Pierre. In 2008, the artist Renzo Martens released his controversial film, Episode 3, Enjoy Poverty, filmed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The film portrayed the artist as a colonial explorer traveling around the Congo's plantations with the naivety of the cartoon character Tintin. Martens' character encounters poverty, hunger, and abuse, all the while narrating the way in which these experiences enrich him as a Western observer. In a manner now familiar in mainstream critical culture, the film was labeled as problematic. Martens' work and method were critiqued widely by an array of commentators. Some have changed their minds since in light of Martens' further work. Others, and I know this from speaking with an editor of a prominent art magazine, won't come anywhere near it even 12 years on, for, and I quote, the fear of inadvertently promoting the practice. Critique and Practice, a volume edited by Anthony Downey, brings together a range of responses to Enjoy Poverty, some dating back to 2008, others more recent. It contains essays by the likes of Dan Fox, Anna Tihira Pinto, Artur Zmajewski, DJ Demas, Judge Charsworth, Ariela Aisha Azoulay, Jacob Costa, and Gregory Scollett. Because it would be impossible to speak to them all, and because I already interviewed Anthony Downey not long ago, I invited Renzo Martens, the subject of the book, and its critiques to join me. Renzo, welcome to the show.
Hi. Glad to be here, Pierre. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. Renzo, we're going to do something slightly unusual today. You are not the author of the book, you're not its editor, you're not even its contributor. You are the subject, or indeed one of your works is. So we're talking about a volume of writings compiled from critiques, critique being an operative word we'll need to get to in a moment, critiques, reviews, and accounts of a project of yours which resulted in a documentary film called Episode 3, Enjoy Poverty, which was released in 2008. Now, that's a long time ago, but there was good reason why we're talking about this book now. There's a good reason why it took Anthony Downey, the editor of the book, to bring this volume together over 10 years. But let's start even before. What is Enjoy Poverty? How did it come about? How did you find yourself working in the Congo and dealing with the notion of poverty?
Wow, that's so much to answer to, Pierre. But I first want to say that the book was edited by Anthony Downey, indeed, and but the whole project was started up earlier by somebody else called Els Roeland, who at some point kind of felt she wasn't the right person anymore, and that's when Anthony, together with Lawrence Otto, took over, and then he, in the end, Anthony, really compiled the book. So it's been a lengthy process for this book to come about. Also because, there have been shifts in appreciation, not just because of other people engaging with it, but also because times obviously change in what the film Enjoy Poverty was or was not. So you can never catch up, really. So, Enjoy Poverty, yes. So I made the film. It came out in 2008. And why did I make that? What was the reason? The standard thing is that I was, and I imagine you want to delve deeper than that, but that I was really interested in images of disaster, war, poverty, as they are being consumed in and outside of the art world by audiences. Certainly at that point, we're talking about 2004 when I first started on the film. So this is just slightly after Oki and Weser's Documenta, for example, and many other shows that really wanted to deal with like the global. And so for the first time in mainstream Western European art world, you had all these documentary films or videos or other types of art forms that dealt with, things like precarious labor situations and indigenous people and the way, of course, indigenous people have been time and again slaughtered and exploited in the art world, images of that. And I was very suspicious, not per se in Documenta, but just at large, of the roles that these images would then play for, by and large, well-to-do white Western art audiences. I was thinking that allowing the viewer, carving out a relatively safe space for viewers to consume or in other ways reflect upon the lives of other people around the globe, wasn't paying justice to the inequalities in power and agency between, on the one hand, the people being portrayed in those videos or in those artworks, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people again consuming or in other ways
Mm-hmm.
getting to know those people. So I thought the medium of documentaries, films, installations, art wasn't properly addressing the discrepancies in relative agency and power between those two parties, people being
Mm-hmm.
filmed on the one hand and people consuming or otherwise engaging with those images on the other hand. And I thought that the images, the way I saw them in documentary film festivals, in the press, and in art shows like Documenta and many others, were in a way obscuring more those power relationships than they were
Mm-hmm.
revealing them, by and large. By and large, I'm not talking about any individual work. I'm speaking about a cultural situation. And I felt that this needed to be challenged and understood, first and foremost by me, of course, understood. So that's what I set out to do, really. So it wasn't my first film. I had made a film prior to that, which was the same, really. And this was in 2000. I went to Chechnya, which at that point was, endured a Russian invasion, not
Mm.
completely unlike the one happening now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it was a real war situation, and it was very dangerous to go there. People had been abducted and kidnapped, and it was really far out to go, even if there wouldn't be a war actually. But now there was a war, and it was really disastrous. So I went there, and I already had made as my singular goal to not paint a picture of the war, but to paint a picture of the power relationships between those stuck in war in various forms and
Mm-hmm.
capacities, on the one hand, and the people um, seeing those images, whether in art or media or journalism or documentary films. So I went to Chechnya. So again, this is 2000, in a way as what I thought to be as a representative of the spectator of,
Mm.
and I kind of embodied that spectator. That's what I tried. Not only the spectator, I was also making a film, of course, but embodying the spectator in war,
Yeah.
spectator of war, embody that spectator in war, with the single goal to again reveal or understand the power relationships at play. So I did that in Chechnya. And so with Enjoy Poverty, I thought I could up the stakes.
Mm-hmm.
I could make it more intelligible. I could push the contradictions to such an extent
Mm.
that everybody would see what the contradictions were. That was my goal.
Maybe just to summarize for listeners what happens in the first film in Chechnya, and I think this is a model that as a kind of behavior, as a trick, the key to both the films would be important to understand. But what you do in Chechnya is not so much go and observe people under the conditions of war, not people in suffering, but you make a film about yourself observing them, and they are there looking at you, and you come up with kind of disarming questions like what do you think of me? Do I look handsome? What does my presence here mean to you people in this refugee camp? I don't remember that film having that much of a circulation at the time. Certainly didn't have that kind of a backlash, didn't have the kind of reception that Enjoy Poverty did. Maybe just it was a way of introducing Enjoy Poverty and some of the plots in that film, which, as you say, explodes maybe some of these techniques and takes them to a level where it's very difficult to look away, very difficult to dismiss what you did enjoy poverty as an experiment that got out of hand.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's an experiment. I think it was really
Mm.
well thought through and elaborated. I'm not, it's a little bit outside of the mainstream, but I would also not classify it as this experimental film. Like we'll see what
Oh,
happens.
I don't think I meant it. I don't think I
Okay,
meant it as an experimental film.
right.
I'm possibly giving you a get out of jail card to claim later on in our conversation that there was a point at which you didn't quite know how much you took on.
Okay.
Like,
Well,
if you
we'll get
did,
there.
you either the Antichrist of a genius or a genius. If you didn't, we can continue.
Well, I won't take either of those as a marker of myself. But no, I did figure out what to do there before I went. So what people end up seeing in the film Enjoy Poverty is that there's this guy. He's kind of in his early 30s. He's white. He's male. He's Western. He speaks French and English in somewhat of an affected way. He kind of trots around the disaster zones of Congo.
Mm,
So the he in this case is me. You know, I was that person. I encounter situations that kind of stand in for the structural inequalities in this world. So I go, for example, to mining zones where there's been constant war for at least 10 years, and where the UN then intervenes to quote unquote stop the war, but also at the same time offer the gold concession to some Western company. So
mm,
what you see is that local people, Congolese people, fight, militia groups fight over gold. This is disastrous for the population who is, pushed to the brink of extinction in certain areas. And then the UN comes in, stops the war, and offers the same gold to a foreign company.
mm,
So while bringing peace, it's also another system of extraction, and this is structural. This is all the time. And of course, it's also what starts wars, because some of the militia groups are allied with the foreign gold concession company, others are not. They all want
mhm,
their piece of the pie. So it's really a quagmire, or I don't know, a shit show of conflicted interests. But
mm,
one thing is for sure: in the end, rich people run with the profits, and impoverished people have absolutely nothing and die without food in refugee camps.
mm,
So that's in war zones. And then I also visited plantation zones where, companies, it wasn't at the time Unilever, but, for all we would know, it could be Unilever or any other
mm,
of those big plantation companies that supply the world with food, palm oil mostly, but also cocoa and coffee and rubber for airplane tires and Formula One tires. It comes from plantations. Now, in these plantations, again, labor conditions are just unimaginable. They're so,
mm.
so, so bad. I had no clue how bad it could be. You literally have people working for $3 a month.
Well, that's interesting because you're making the film at a time where actually the art world, the media, is full of reports of these appalling conditions. The reason the film is so upsetting to watch back in the West is that you have yourself playing this character, confronting the reality, this horrible reality, and being complicit with it and being sort of interested in solving that problem, but also knowing that you can't solve the problem, that you won't solve the problem,
That's exactly right.
but that your presence there, your kind of holiday there, is still of some value, and it is of value to you more than to the people who are there, who are all believe that you're there to help them, because you're white, you turn up, you've got a camera, you're going to ask them questions, and it is indeed heartbreaking at various moments of the film to to
Yes,
to see
it is.
people who are completely deprived of the ability to feed themselves and their families treating you like a messiah, only to understand that 10 minutes after the camera is turned off, they are back exactly where they started, just with slightly broken hopes. So you were saying a moment ago that you expected to be able to do exactly this. So I want to ask you a little bit about how you up the ante, so to say, from just the depiction of the horrific state of affairs in which Unilever, to all intents and purposes, and therefore we as shareholders are responsible, but we have this fantastic way of second-hand engagements in which it's got, none of this has anything to do with us down the line. How did you plan to make the viewer, the art world, the artist yourself, and in fact, everyone who ended up having to, for a variety of reasons, to condemn your film later. How did you plan for that level of inescapability in that work?
I had rehearsed it in Chechnya.
Mhm.
I had rehearsed how to do it. I had rehearsed indeed how to break off all exits. Now, one of the key exits that is offered by art and journalism and even the economic systems that actively intervene in places like Congo, like aid, for example, that intervene in those disaster zones, they kind of hinge on the idea that images of poverty will somehow, images taken of, desperate situations will somehow create awareness, and the awareness will somehow
Mhm.
bring material change down the line somewhere. And I just knew that that wasn't true. It,
Yeah.
it may well bring some awareness, but it doesn't bring material change. And how did I know that to be true? Because the apparatus that is supposed to bring the material change, like any other industry, keeps 60, 70, in some cases 90% of all the surplus value that they generate for
Yeah.
themselves. So taking images of impoverished people while then leaving the biggest chunk of whatever material change that could bring in terms of donations or aid or what have you for themselves, it effectively turns the whole operation in another extractive economy. You take images of poor people and you take whatever revenue, you keep it for yourself for the biggest part. So I knew that the material change that it could potentially bring on the ground was really little compared to what the claims would be. And this is true for humanitarian aid. It's also true for the art world, of course. I
Mhm.
knew just from simply observing it that yes, you can have great, big, almost encyclopedic art exhibitions about the state of the world. In the end, where is this going to bring benefits? It's going to bring benefits mostly to the people who are able to visit those exhibitions and
Yeah.
have cappuccinos and this and that discussions, PhDs, spin-offs economically, emotional, etc., etc. And it will bring very little relatively to whomever the people are who are being displayed, of whom people talk in those
Mm.
images, films, installations, what have you. So a simple structural calculation of, where the benefits will end up of any type of material change that could be brought told me that it's not going to bring material change.
Yeah.
And there are many examples in the film. For example, Doctors Without Borders, which, is kind of one of the most respected humanitarian aid organizations in the world for disaster relief, stuff like that. Even they suffer from all of these things that I just
Mm.
said. Even they who really go out in the woods and treat people, the biggest part of the people are not treated, and they will never be in the image. And the people who are
Yeah.
in the image of the photographs of the good deeds of Doctors Without Borders. So the biggest parts of reality on the ground, the people not being helped, or the people being helped, but most of the money that is generated by images of them going to other places than those people being helped, um, most of that remains obscure. In effect, images of these operations obscure more than they reveal.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to show all of that. I wanted to show all of that, but how to do it? So I rehearsed some of the strategies in Chechnya, employing myself, like casting myself almost, as this indeed white white male artist, um, of course from a rich capitalist country, the Netherlands in my case, going out, being concerned, and in the end making images, playing the part, and in the end going home with some art piece. It's maybe good to say that I didn't only rehearse it myself. I think probably 90% of every single word I utter in Enjoy Poverty is a literal quote from other people. So when I say, for
Mm.
example, one of the most grueling scenes is when I'm in a plantation and people say that they want to just, get out of poverty. And I explain to them, well, chances that this is going to happen, you getting more money, are really, really slim.
Mm.
It's probably not going to happen. Probably in 10 years, you'll still be poor like you are now. It's funny to know, to observe that this is more than 10 years ago. And indeed, the
Of
situations
course.
are
Yeah.
exactly the same on most plantations. So it wasn't exactly like a lie that I was telling.
Mm.
And then I say, well, we hope you bring something and this and that. And I say, no, I won't bring anything. I'm just enacting the status quo. And then they can see that they will try and be happy despite being poor. And then I commend them for them and say, that's really great. And observing your suffering really makes me into a better human being,
Mm.
is what I tell them, which is gruesome. But it is also an exact Angelina Jolie quote when she's sent out by UNHCR into, the refugee camps in, I don't know where she went, all over the globe. This is exactly what she says to the CNN camera. Maybe she doesn't say it to the people that she just met, but she says it to anybody who has a TV and can switch on CNN.
Yeah.
Observing these people suffering makes me a better human being, or helps me being a better human being. So I thought, oh, if that is what impoverished people have to offer me, aside from all the resources that are being extracted from them, aside from me being able to make a film about it and then exhibit it in art shows, maybe this is the added value that they really bring me. So if that's true, let's
Yeah.
just, create a level playing field and bring that argument into the dialogue and see how gruesome it is, how indeed it is gruesome to say that. But if it's gruesome, then it's not just gruesome for me, it's also
Mm.
gruesome for Angelina Jolie and UNHCR
Yeah.
apparatus.
So let's talk about the critique that you received when the film was circulated in 2008, 2009. I remember seeing it quite early on, and I think like the vast majority of people within the art world at the time, my first reaction was that of revulsion. It didn't last long, which is why we're talking now. I've been a fanboy for your practice for quite a while, but it did take a long time for these kind of great suspicions to recede. And if I remember correctly, and also readings through, this is why the book is incredibly interesting for anyone interested in the interaction between art, the art world, and politics, and the image. Why it's so interesting to look at a chronological catalogue of opinions and reviews and essays written about the work. The critiques go somewhere from, on the one hand, oh, this is all complicit. Martens is making money. He's making a living of exploiting those people. He's not as good as Oxfam or Médecins Sans Frontières. So, he's just a corrupt artist. So we must therefore pretend that he's not a good artist because, God forbid, artists should be like that. So that's kind of one critique, which was probably enough for most critics. And the other thing that you already alluded to, which I think plagued me for a little bit, is the violence of this kind of utterance. This is not going to work for you. And I was thinking at the time, I remember about, how we have certain gradations of ethical training in, say, the healthcare system. Like, who is allowed to tell a patient's family that the patient died? A hospital porter mustn't do it. You have to do it following a certain protocol.
Yeah.
And what you do, of course, in the film is you break that protocol over and over again, and each time with slightly more brutality before you go into this kind of completely trivializing. But it's okay, you're going to be poor, dance around, let's have a party. And you have this neon sign that says enjoy poverty, please, and it kind of daintily flashes, which is your kind of aesthetic brand for this whole exercise. So given that I've got you the subject of critique, I want to ask you about your experience of living with all of this critique, some of which has been, savage for an artist, some of it is still in the book, some of it was much more thought through, but I'm sure it wasn't a lot of fun to deal with it in person. So how did you treat that? Like, does the character you had in the film, developed for the film, continue then to absorb and kind of have this critiques wash over him?
Mhm. Well, the critiques weren't exactly new to me. I think some of them, I invented them myself. That's why I do these things in the film.
Yeah.
Like if in the film I say, and I'll stick with the same line, when I say in the film to impoverished plantation workers, probably they're going to remain as poor, and the chances that their situation, their circumstances are going to improve anytime soon are really slim. and that I advise them to try and be happy despite being poor. And then I say that their suffering makes me a better human being. You can't invent any of that and then put it in an edit of a well-thought film if you're not aware of how gruesome that is. You don't do it by accident. And as I mentioned, almost every line that I utter in the film is a direct quote from either a media personality, a well-known person, or from World Bank official messages, official policy messages. So I'm not inventing anything really. So I'm not doing anything new really. And everything I utter in the film is part of what I conceive to be the status quo. I'm enacting the status quo. Now, I wouldn't be enacting that status quo if I agreed with it. Then I would just make films about, people in Congo, and then, this and that happens, and just a regular, vanilla, if you will, documentary film about suffering in Congo and people helping. That is what I would do if I agreed with that status quo. But I don't agree with it. I think they're all lies. And so that's why I bring those lies into the film. That's when I don't, when I say lies, I mean they're disingenuous. It's disingenuous for Angelina Jolie to say your suffering makes me into a better person, and say that not to the people whom you ascribe equality to. They are teachers for her, apparently, but she only says it to the CNN cameras. So I thought, if that is true, and if it's true for her, it must be true for me, then I should say that to those people. You are actually giving me a service. You're helping me be a better person. That's the state of the world that we are in. That $100 million net revenue Hollywood star can go to poor people, beset by war and disaster, and then say to the global audiences that these poor people help her, while not really giving them anything. That's what she does, right? She hasn't said that to any of those people. She hasn't given them the badge like, hey, thank you. You really helped me. So I thought, let's see what that really means. So that's what I do in the film. So to come back to your question, I think the critique is already in the film. At least that's what I've tried to do. I try to actively create kind of a closed room in which all the exits, the rooms or the escape valves or what have you, they're all closed off. Like it's a portrait of capitalism. The film is a portrait of capitalism. And any of our ways out, or our usual ways out, or we help the poor, or we create awareness, or we do it because we bring economic, in the end, they're suffering now, but in the end, it'll get better because there will be economic development, or we have to have like more care and love and more community. That's what's really going to help impoverished people. All of these strategies, I kind of employ them throughout film, and you see that they're all kind of falling apart. And I think it's kind of a good, I think it's kind of really a good portrait of that status quo. I still think so.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the most pertinent question came out from that work is the question of what level of critique, what would count as a success in a critique to justify the potential side effect, the damage that it causes, as it does, and that I think
But
that remains kind
I
of
think there's a
difficult.
question. There is a question in that. So when you say the damage it causes, I would like you to situate where that damage is caused.
I think I can probably see where you're going with this, and I'm going to agree that the damage is probably caused both by me and it is to me in acknowledging as a viewer, acknowledging that I'm deeply uncomfortable with what you're doing. In a certain sense, I brought up this example of having the surgeon tell the patient's family that the operation was not successful, as
Yeah,
opposed to just an administrator. It frankly doesn't really make any difference if we are all part of the same system that has caused the operation to go a certain way or have contributed to it. So that damage is at least half to my self-esteem. But because I was hoping that I'd have a gotcha question for you later, so I'm going
sure,
to turn this back into you
sure.
and ask you again then, what are the success factors? Like even if we even if we ignore, if not ignore the negatives, what would constitute success of that particular mode of critique?
So now that I know you have a got you question in mind, I'm gonna.
No,
And I
it's a
do.
little bit later.
It's a little bit
Uh,
later. No, and I'm sure I have an idea where, because I made works after this, right? Or I
it's,
tried,
we're getting there, of
and
course.
we're getting there. I'm sure. Yeah. Um. So I think at the time, I'll take responsibility for what I did at the time and why I wanted to do it. I thought success was simply to make a piece uh, that would be really frank about the state of the world. It's a
Mm,
portrait of the world, and of course, success in a less sophisticated way would be success like art shows or praise or this or
mm,
that. And indeed, you said I was in the doghouse. Well, first of all, prior to making this film, I was nowhere. So being in the doghouse was better than being nowhere. And and it wasn't too bad because I think again that I kind of owned the critique levered at the film. What was painful at times, especially if it came from people that I respected and admired, is that they would, if people would not see that it was on purpose or not see that the biggest part of the damage was inflicted on them as viewers rather than on impoverished people in Congo.
mm,
If people would accuse me of mistreating people in Congo for my own advantage, if I could, that was painful, of course. And if my one line of defense, which I still have, is it's not me, it's the world. I'm just a stand-in for standing practice in the art world and in the economy at large. So please don't accuse me, accuse the system, accuse yourself, whatever. Now, as to your second line of critique that you identified, that while making a piece like this, I was still victimizing impoverished people. Hope and I think that I've inflicted way more damage on viewers than on any of the people that is in the film. The people in the film, if their biggest problem would be that there's a white guy saying that they will remain poor, I mean, God, that's kind of common knowledge if you work on a plantation. The funny
yeah,
thing is that a white guy will actually come and tell you that. The more habitual thing is that a white guy comes, or a black guy sent by a white guy, or a black guy altogether and says, hey, I'm going to cut your wages because the
mm,
economy or whatever. That's like the normal thing. That happens every
yeah,
day. That's how you end up on $3 a month. So a white guy is saying, hey, you're probably going to remain poor. And, it's really sad, but I don't know what we could do. Probably nothing. That's really not going to inflict so much damage on the
yeah.
people who are in those circumstances. They kind of know all of that. They kind of know all of that. Yeah. So I think
Mm,
where it inflicts damage is on the self image of art consumers or art lovers or art, you know, people involved in art who we like to think that we are somehow miraculously a force for better or for good by engaging with people in impoverished areas. That somehow miraculously this will bring material benefits for the people who are being portrayed or whose work is being shown or what have you. And sometimes it does, certainly. But
yeah.
on an industry level, I don't think it does. And that's what I try to portray.
I have a feeling that actually a lot of this critique, as fierce as it might have been at the time, has not really been absorbed by the art world. And as a slight aside, I'm going to propose that the most recent edition of Documenta, curated by Rang Rupa, is a strange result of the art world failing to recognize what it is that you've just described. This idea that art liberates the world through just shining a light onto situations without necessarily following through on any particular material demands and political demands.
I would agree with you, uh, but there's one difference with the current Documenta, and that is that at least from what I understand, on a surface level, it's really a documenta made by groups of artists, collectives, who representing people who would otherwise be the subject of such art.
Mhm.
And now, from what I understand, again, on a surface level, people are representing themselves. And I think that in and of itself could be a big difference.
that's maybe a fantastic segue to talk about the work you've made since Enjoy Poverty, since 2008, which maybe responds to some of this description. So after you made the film, you co-founded the Institute of Human Activities, which set about trying to open an art center in a place called Lusanga, formerly known as Leverville, which is a plantation in the middle of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly owned by Unilever, the Lever brothers. How did that come about, and how does that connect to the legacy of Enjoy Poverty?
So the film kind of struck gold. Okay, but I thought it doesn't really. Yeah, I thought there was one missing part really, and that is the fact that even this piece, and I knew this in advance, of course, but even this piece in the end is being shown in well-to-do, um, urban
Hmm.
urban art shows in global cities for well-to-do audiences. Almost invariably, it would be for people who, have the time, the energy, the resources, the education, etc., to deal with art. So I thought, well, this piece too, even if, it supposedly deals with impoverished people in Congo and how they do not benefit from the art world, that's certainly one of the key problems addressed in Enjoy Poverty. The film does the same. And I knew that the film would do the same. Of course, that's why I made it. But still, I thought if there is a way out of this scheme, then more self-reflection will not cut it. And so if there is a way out, if art is not only to either please or displease people in the art world, if it is to really engage with those global circumstances, economic circumstances more than anything, then I can't suffice with just making critical art, however good that critique is. Like the prospect of making another Enjoy Poverty was completely alien to me. And so I kind of made this little scheme in my mind. I mean, a schematic analysis of how the art world operates. And I thought, okay, on the one hand, you have these zones of extraction. And certainly Congo, not Congo Kinshasa, where, you have very rich people and you have an art scene and you have even museums and galleries and what have you. No, the zones of extractions are the mines and the plantations, and the slums where people who
Mm.
flee the mines and the plantations end up. These are zones of extraction and they're subject matter. There's zones of extraction in the way that the diamonds and the gold and the cocoa is extracted from it. There are also zones of extraction in the way that you can take content from it and then put it in art shows. I thought, unless there is a feedback loop into those zones of extraction, economically, not exclusively economically, but also economically, then I don't want to do it anymore. I'm not going to make another extractive film, even if it deals with extraction, as I think Enjoy Poverty in the most brutal way that I think is imaginable, for me anyway, that I can imagine.
Mm.
It deals with extraction. I'm not going to make another piece that is extractive in that way. So now it needs to be regenerative. So of course, I was in the doghouse of the art world, but nevertheless, I got to travel a little bit, and I visited New York for the first time in my life, and I saw, Eflux opening shop, and I saw all my heroes, people that I had, articles I had read in Eflux and in other magazines and in Art Forum, and I saw happening in front of my eyes the problematization of gentrification in the Lower East Side. So the very common analysis already from the 1980s that art pretends to be about social justice and critique and analysis and this and that, but what it does in material terms is just make real estate prices rise. And we all know it's true, and we all, we're all stuck and this and that, and okay. And I thought, well, if that's the way it is, whether we like it or not, if that is the way it is, maybe this can be actively employed. So what I imagined is we can build a reverse gentrification program on one of these plantations to actively use this, call it a side effect if you want to, or call it the ultimate goal of art if you want that. The fact that it accumulates capital and makes real estate prices go up, and create shops and boutiques and whatever. All of that, we can, rather than dismiss it and close our eyes for it, and we can actively employ it. So that's what I thought. These are simple ideas, I concede, but I thought let's
Well,
just
these
try and
these are ideas that were circulating quite a lot 10
yeah,
years ago, and even before that, Richard Florida is credited, I think, with creating quite a lot of Western cities regeneration plans with the proposal that creative workforces bring with them
right,
prosperity just by sheer virtue of being creative.
yes,
It's not like we haven't seen that come to a pass in the West over the last 10 years or so.
yeah. It was employed a lot, but it wasn't
Mm.
employed. It was looked down upon in the critical art world.
Mm.
It was employed, of course, like every museum in the West employs, while it's being either founded or financed, employs these narratives. But artists, the section of artists that I would like to be part of, which is like critical artists engaged with the position of art in political and economic structures. That's the type of art I like.
Mhm.
Those types of artists very often simply dismissed gentrification, dismissed the fact that art would also generate capital,
Yeah.
or only wanted to look at it critically. While, of course, even the shows or the texts or the this and that would be published in parts of the world that would be gentrifying fast, like New
Mm.
York City or Berlin, the key example, of course. So I thought, rather than being critical about it, sure, I am critical about it, sure, of course, but let's employ it. It seems to be inevitable. Let's employ it. So that's what I try to do, to try and employ that. So that's when yeah, the reverse gentrification program, when I imagined it, like provisionally, and I like the first step was to identify a place where it could potentially happen, which is a former Unilever palm oil plantation in Congo. Um, Significant because Unilever was a big funder of the arts, most notably in London at that time, Tate Modern
Mhm.
in London, the Unilever series with Segal and Ai Reve and Olafur Eliasson, and all of them funded by Unilever to
Mhm.
do art. So I thought a Unilever plantation is kind of a perfect place to kind of, jumpstart this regenerative art in which we would use the gentrifying powers of art to reverse what gentrification is, for whom it has significance, and where capital would potentially accumulate. So that's what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Well, could we just sketch out very briefly for listeners who might be a little bit lost here, just what exactly happened? Because there is, I think, a slight terminological difference in the kind of Richard Florida idea of gentrification through art, where he would go and move artists into up and coming areas and hope that the up and comingness would self realize. Whereas what you are proposing, that turning plantation workers and the inhabitants of Lusanga into artists, should have the same kind of effect. From a distance, it has had that kind of effect. We are now a year after the release of your second big film in the Congo called The White Cube. There is an art center called the White Cube in Lusanga, which is in a structure. It has a roof. Does it actually have a roof? I can't quite remember. There was a point at which we were fundraising for a roof
Yeah.
in a manner of like a parish church, or forever collecting for a roof replacement. You work with a collective of artists who are based in on the plantation, who exhibit internationally, sometimes alongside you, sometimes under their own name of the organization, sometimes individually. But I think we have to unpack a little bit what it is that is happening here, because this would be lovely to say that we taught the man to fish and he was he was able to feed himself forever. It's not like you went and brought an art school to the Congo and suddenly there was demand for artistic practices from the Congo, which now brings finances back to Lusanga.
Now, first of all, I'm not a very good fisher myself, so I really could not teach anybody to fish. But luckily, people are really great fishers themselves, all over the world, and also in Lusanga and Congo. Of course, the very region where the White Cube has been erected. This region has been part of the art world kind of forever, in many ways. Like, first of all, the people employed by Unilever on the plantation were not exclusively, but were often of the Pende people who have made kind of the masterpieces for the ages, like the Metropolitan Museum in New York has, these highly prized and heavily insured masterpieces of Pende art in their
Mm-hmm.
collection. So it's not like people don't know how to make art. They do. And
Mm-hmm.
they have been doing so forever. So that's one thing. Another way in which the people in Lusanga have been actively involved in the art world is that they financed art exhibitions and museums, most notably in the UK, through their labor. Involuntarily, they co-produced the Unilever series. They co-produced
Mm.
Ai Weiwei's work. They co-produced Louise Bourgeois'
Yeah.
work. They co-produced Bruce Nauman's work. They're in a way stakeholders in of all of these artistic careers of some of the biggest artists of the 20th century. Yeah, they're definitely part of the art world in that way also. So it's not. It's just my point. Like I needed to teach anybody anything about art. I did not. So the only intervention I think I needed to make was say, well, it's quite simple. There's really nothing to it. If art is able to accumulate capital in places like New York or Berlin or what have you, if art is interested in critical views on the global economy, of course it is, that's kind of the bread and butter of main art shows over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And if also there's the need that I feel myself, but we all feel it, that the subjects of critical art should be the ones making the art and not simply be subjects,
Mm-hmm.
should be allowed to be the voices that speak. If that is also true, and I think it is true. And if, on the other hand, these are all the possibilities that I paint. If, on the other hand, let's talk a little bit about the impossibilities. These are vast zones in central Congo where there has never, ever been a curator. Like no curator ever came to Lusanga or any of the other Unilever plantations to ask, hey, we're going to make a critical art show about the global economy and we want the people who are part of, let's say, the extraction zones to be part in our show. Do you maybe make art? Zero. Like nobody ever came to those plantations. That has hundreds of thousands of people, many of them extremely talented, and some of them with real, I wouldn't say careers, but practices, artistic practices.
Yeah.
Zero, zero, zero. So that it seems like a very easy thing to put two and two together and say, well, let's build an art center here. All the incentives are there, the possibilities are there, and apparently nobody so far that I know of did it. So there's like an open field.
We were at a moment where two different things are coming together, Renzo. And so one, and as much as Enjoy Poverty was critiqued widely, I think what you're doing now is receiving quite a lot of warm reception in the art world. I don't know whether the White Cube, the film, has circulated particularly widely, but the works that we're talking about, the sculpture works in particular, made by the artist on the plantation, the artist in Lusanga, have been shown to some acclaim in places like the Sculpture Center in New York. One of the times we saw each other was when your practice, but through that, their practice was nominated for the Artis Mundi Prize in Wales and Cardiff. So I think there is a recognition in the art world that there is a need to go beyond the representation. The first thing you critiqued. But I want to ask whether you feel that the extractivist model that you were critiquing originally is not still present in the practice as it is now. So I think the technicality that I'm interested in first is really to try to understand the flow of capital. So under your classical gentrification model, a locality invests itself in opening an art center and things. Eventually, the tourists, the artists are going to come. This is all going to be great. But I think it would be a little bit disingenuous to think that that's exactly what happened in Lusanga. No, like I received a newsletter from your organization, the Institute of Human Activities, the other day,
Hmm.
and the number of funders credits at the bottom of the email is like 5 lines long.
Hmm.
So I'm not necessarily interested in testing Richard Flores' thesis because he's wrote back on it himself since his first quest came out.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in thinking about how Western capital continues to be involved in producing the capital infrastructure, the museum, the white cube in Lusanga, as it was in producing all the capital infrastructure of the plantation.
Mm.
So I'm trying to kind of pussyfoot around the question of whether what you're doing isn't exactly the same under certain conditions. Is there a way in which the same kind of extractivist nature of Western capital isn't just now performing under different guise? So it used to be a plantation, now it's an art factory. I think that's a question that mustn't be ignored.
Mm. No, it's a good question, but I can be very straight in my answer. The answer is no.
And I've expected that.
Yes. Well, good. So first of all, the funding, the 5 lines of funding that you saw. Yes, of course, there's a lot of funding. I mean, there's not enough funding. I think we need much, much, much more funding. But sure, there has been some funding to build a museum, to set up infrastructure, and most of that money comes from the West. And I think it's normal. I think most museums are built with funding. I don't know how else it's done. Sometimes communities, there are some examples, build their own museum and finance everything themselves. But it seems that the people in Lusanga and the other Unilever plantation in Congo already did that part. They funded the Lady Lever Gallery in Liverpool, brick by brick. That's been paid for by the extraction of capital from plantations in Congo. And of course, Liverpool workers as well, but they had their share. They had the Port Sunlight, it's pretty, they had an arts program there, that kind of seemed to have evened out a tiny bit. But in Congo, definitely, the people have already paid their fair share of financing museums. Not just the Lady Lever Gallery, the Leverhulme Trust, right? Many
Sure.
UK academics are, indebted to the Leverhulme Trust and therefore to plantation workers in Congo. So I think they pay their fair share. And of course, Tate Modern, the Unilever series, I mentioned it earlier, paid for by plantation workers in Congo. So I think now that there is this idea, and I brought it up, that a museum should be built on that very site of extraction, I think it would be really disingenuous to say, well, after you've paid for Tate Modern and the Lady Lever Gallery and the Leverhulme Trust, now you're also going to pay for your own little museum on the plantation. So no, the money needs to come from the West. Of course, it needs to come from the West. And so I do what I can, and it's not enough, but I try to make sure that money comes. And it's a very modest museum. Like it's like, it's not, it doesn't even have like 2 stories or something. It's a modest museum. It's state of the art, but it's modest, in its size. And every museum, like Tate Modern or any other museum, is built by patrons, benefactors, some government subsidy, a nice mix of all of that. It's not paid for by the people who come in and pay a ticket, or sometimes it's free, so you don't pay a ticket. So they don't pay for the museum. It's paid by money that comes from either private individuals who are rich, or from democratically organized societies. So
right.
in this case, it comes from both.
Just to make it clear, Renzo, that's not actually the core of my critique. I'm
No,
more
that was
interested.
just the first part. I wanted to, you made a big point about the 5 lines, so I wanted to first speak about that. And I think it builds up to your larger argument that this would be extractive, that now first there was an extractive plantation, and now there's an extractive art factory, as you call it. So there is an art practice. I don't think it's extractive. I think the contrary is true. The money that comes in from the sales or sometimes production budgets for art goes to the community. It doesn't go to me. I take 0% of that, as I should. I'm not saying it's great that I don't take any percentage. Of course I don't take any percentage. And of course I don't. And so I don't. So the money goes to the community, and the community uses it, first of all, to better their own life standards, and second, to buy land that of course belongs to them in the first place. They shouldn't have to buy it, but political, economic, military reality in Congo is such that if you don't buy it, you won't survive.
Yeah.
So if you want it back, you will need to buy it. Okay, so we buy it. We here being CATPC, the cooperative of artists, plantation workers in Lusanga. So if there is any extraction, it is also reversed. The money goes back to the community. Typically, a plantation tries to get money from, for example, Lusanga and bring it to London. Here, money is brought from, for example, London and brought back to Lusanga. But I think it's even deeper than that. I think it's even to some minor degree a kind of way to get outside of any extractivist logic. Because as soon as people own their own land, which they now do, you can build your own society to some minor degree. It's not all of the former Unilever plantations. Maybe that will come one day, but for now, it's just like, I don't know, 200 acres or 300 acres or something to that effect. They're constantly buying, on which the community plants trees and provides food security and allows them to no longer cut the last remaining virgin forests to have fertile land and timber, etc., etc. So I think what it does is that through, of course, employing or taking a tiny stake in this art apparatus, extracting money from it to, with that money, build a world that can, to some minor degree, be free of that extractivist logic.
Okay. I'm not going to apologize for phrasing my question clumsily and pushing you into delivering this
Not at all. It's a
fantastic
conversation.
defense of the project. I do not wish to question the actual movements of finance in your particular project. And as much as there's only hope for the world, it does come from this kind of traditional mode of decolonization where communities can be rendered autonomous from the systems of economic exploitations. But I think within all of this, what really still intrigues me is the limit of what it is that you're trying to do. And to take it away from maybe your individual project, it strikes me that the question of whether the art world, not art per se, but the art world as a fundamentally capitalist enterprise can be anything other than extractivist. That is the question that I think we might have to think about if we, as you have at points proposed, the model that you have developed here could be scaled. Now, the things that have become really interesting is to see how you've moved from the doghouse into this kind of decolonization. Actually, no, I'm not going to start describing you with the superlatives which you might not even want, but you won't have escaped you that over the last couple of years, the art world is hot on restitution and hot on decolonization, as a lot of liberal disciplines and liberal institutions are. You've also started a project with the Congolese artist, which is trying to ride on that, and I think in incredibly clever ways. But I wonder whether there isn't a very difficult point of dependency in the fact that it's fashionable for the art world to, at the moment, to think of itself as not racist, as somehow being inclined to give away the looted artifacts of one nation after another. I mean, there are millions of examples if we really counted them up properly.
Yeah.
And for me, the fact that I'm asking you this question, the fact that I feel free to ask you these questions, comes from a scene in your latest film, White Cube. There is a bunch of scenes where you're talking to camera, explaining the project, and there's a stack of books in one of those shots. And in one of them, the book we're talking about now, the Critique in Practice volume, is lying on top of underneath Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. And I don't think that any of our listeners who have heard me before needs to be told that I think that's essentially race woo-woo designed to make everything worse while making liberals feel a little bit better about themselves temporarily. You don't have to say anything about the book or Robin DiAngelo, but the fact that we are in a kind of trend which I really have to be suspicious of. I really don't see how a capital market like the art world does not, in the end, find a way of extracting resources from those who can least part with them. That's the meta question, essentially.
No, I agree with the meta question. You bring up a lot of things, so I'm happy you bring them up. So first, on restitution and decolonization, as like indeed main tropes in the art world for with a lot of traction. They, of course, can be extractive in and of themselves. I know for a fact that people who do well in those exhibitions, in the end, buy an apartment in a Western global city with a revenue. So even if now there are many, finally, Black artists, artists of color, women artists, artists of every denomination that are part of the art world, which I think is very good and very important. Sometimes they become the ones that mine the world for content to offer it to still mostly Western, liberal, well-to-do audiences. And so one of the initial questions that I try to deal with, even prior to making an Enjoy Poverty, is who benefits from these analyses? Who benefits from the critique? Who benefits from decolonization? And I think one of the answers one could give, maybe not the only one, is that mostly white, liberal, well-to-do audiences at this point in history benefit far more from decolonization than people on mines and in plantations in Congo, as one other example. I can tell you for a fact that on mines and in plantations in Congo, people have never heard of decolonization in the art world, let alone that they have any stake in it. It's completely sterile to them. I know for a fact that the owners of those plantations are interested in decolonization. They fund art shows about decolonization, but their workers have zero stake in decolonization. So this is all absolutely true. In the mainstream, normal plantations and mines, I will repeat it, the owners, the shareholders of these plantations and mines are very hot on decolonization. They fund art shows about decolonization. Their workers on the ground have never heard of decolonization, not from their bosses anyway. I mean, they will discuss it. They know of Lumumba and his political struggles, and surely they want to decolonize with or without using that term. Of course, everybody wants to be free of oppression. Of course, everybody wants that, to be free of it. But it's not like the move of decolonization that is going through the art world has any impact in those mines on those plantations. It has way more impact in those art shows that are, offering up decolonization.
Does in a sense, this is a repetition of the process that you critiqued and Enjoy Poverty,
Yes.
the ogling at the miseries, just the performance of
Of
fixing the
liberation.
problem is just,
Yes. It's a performance of fixing the problem, for sure.
Mm.
Yeah. It's performative to a very, very large degree. But it's very hard to critique these performances because, who doesn't want to be free? Who wouldn't want to support the opportunity for people who are in utter misery, structural, organized misery, who would want to stop their process of liberation? I mean, I definitely don't want to do that. I would want to support it in any way I can.
Sure.
Absolutely. But I think the art shows aren't really the ones doing it very often. Why? Not because the art is bad or good, or that doesn't even matter, because there is no redistribution. There is nothing that deals with the materiality of it. The art shows are still in Kassel or in this or in that, and relatively little of the effects, the positive effects of art is going to be redistributed to the communities who desperately want to decolonize themselves. Now, sometimes, I mean, one can have different opinions, and I also fluctuate through them. I cycle through them myself. Maybe the role of art is not to bring material change. Maybe it's just to put it on the agenda so that other people can bring material change. Maybe. That's kind of a standard answer. It's about keeping those thoughts alive, about putting them in the limelight. Maybe after having seen a decolonial show, people at the World Bank will also decide to decolonize, or companies like Unilever, after they've done a lot of advertisements saying that they are an equal opportunity employer and are against racism. Maybe they will decide that people that worked for them forever on plantation in Congo also deserve a pension. Maybe one day will come. it hasn't come yet, but maybe it will come, and maybe only that is the role of art. Who knows? I don't have any other tool than art. Like, I'm not also a banker, or I'm not also a lawyer, or also a politician. My only tool is art, and I like to take it really seriously, um, as good as I can. And so I think within what art can do, certainly money is involved, certainly capital is involved, certainly um, different types of agency are involved. So again, why not employ them in the best way possible? So yes, I share some of your suspicion towards the tight embrace of Western art audiences of decolonization. It doesn't cost them so much to decolonize, unless it will also pay those pensions of those plantation workers on plantations in Congo.
Yeah.
Then it will cost something. Of course, that's where we need to get at. I want to get at that point. The pensions need to be paid. The minimum wage needs to be established there. Then we will have decolonization. Of course, not before that time. Now, there are some art practices that push for that. And I like to think that I'm part of one of those. Now, I don't think this project is as well regarded in these decolonial circles as you may like to imagine. I think I would love CATPC's work to be everywhere, because it would be great. It would generate more money, more land could be bought, pensions could be paid, for example. But so it's way, way, way smaller than I would like it to be. And I think one of the reasons why it's made smaller is that people within that section of the art will look at it with suspicion still. And of course, that's legacy of Enjoy Poverty. I created it myself. I can't blame anybody. But they look at it with suspicion because it doesn't only point at the solution. The problems are also pointed at. The fact that the first batch of sculptures by CATPC was reproduced. They were originally made in clay, in like earth from the plantation, but they were reproduced in Cardiff, in Sculpture Centre, and elsewhere, in cocoa and palm fat, in chocolate, if you will, from the plantation. So obviously that points at a problem. Chocolate is a consumer article that you can find in any cappuccino bar next to the museum, or in any department store, or we consume it. Some of us, at least, consume it on a daily basis, and those people do not get pensions, right? The people working on these plantations do not get pensions. So by age 65, if you're kicked out of the plantation because you can't work anymore, you'll either die of hunger or your children take care of you. So anyway, so the thing points at the problem, I think. Even building a white cube on a plantation is regarded by some as a provocation, and not a provocation in a good way. Like, oh, it's great that finally there's also a white cube on the plantation that funded Tate Modern. That would be good. But people see it as a bad thing. Like, why would you want to build a white cube which is white and which is Western and which is modernist? Why would you want to bring that, a signifier of this extractive, murderous apparatus, to a plantation? Isn't that colonial rather than decolonial? And why is there a white man involved? Me, Renzo. Can we take it seriously, really? Even the article you mentioned in the New Yorker asks all those questions. There's a fair amount of suspicion even in that article. It's great that it's in the New Yorker. It's extremely well written, but it's suspicious also. And I think the suspicion is really because it doesn't carve out. I think the project does not carve out a safe space for Western liberal art lovers. It does that to some degree, and we depend on it to some degree. Otherwise, it will never be shown. It will never be funded. It will die of hunger, the program and the people in it. But it also continuously points back at the problem. Why is there only one white cube? Why is there now a white cube? Why is there only one? Why wasn't there one before? Why are white cubes only in rich cities and never on the plantations that feed the rich cities? These are structural and important questions that the project asks.
Yeah, I think that's a concerted defense of the project Thank you, Renzo. I want to ask you, given all those difficulties, on whom and which kind of activity the owners for its continued success or feasible replication, which is one of the things you were proposing over the years, where the onus lies. So to a certain extent, the question is about aesthetics and about where is art, where is the NGO, where are you an artist, where are you a charity administrator, and I think that's quite easy to dispense with that particular one. There's also an aspect in which the artist from Siete Passet, the collective, whose work is traded, I imagine, mostly in the West as opposed to within the Congo, and that's where the money comes from for the restitution for acquisitions of land. The question of the quality of the work in the broader sense of that word is relevant. Is it on them to keep on producing work that will be exciting enough for Sculpture Center New York and its likes for the next 10 years? Or is it something that the NGO has to keep on doing? Or is maybe the aesthetic aspect, frankly, kind of irrelevant because there's an underlying tone? Maybe the Robin DiAngelo dig, which I've ascribed to you, is what actually drives the success. Maybe the aesthetics is in the liberal guild that is, for the moment, driving all the decolonizing forces. And I kind of what I'm asking underneath this all is like, should it all go wrong? And that's my kind of nihilism. Liberalism does make you a nihilist in the end. And that's possibly why I liked your early work. Should it all go wrong, who gets left with what? I'm almost channeling an art student who I remember asking you a version of this question at a really long time ago, a conversation in Vanna Bay Museum. Like, do your colleagues on the plantation at the least get left with beautiful art that makes them feel better about themselves, as we are told at art school, art was supposed to do for us all?
Yeah. So first of all, there is no NGO. You keep on mentioning a NGO. I don't know which NGO you refer to. There is no NGO here. The Human Activities, or the IHA, is not an NGO. We're an organization. I founded it together with the help of others. I founded it to create a level playing field to make sure that critique on economic inequality could bypass that inequality in one way or the other. And we work together with CATPC, which is a cooperative, the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League. So none of these two organizations are NGOs.
Well, I think I was using this term in a slightly more metaphorical sense, but I marked the distinction.
So back to the aesthetic question. Oh yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the possibility that really the main driver of the project is this white liberal guild, that produces the work really, or the aesthetics, and that is the key component, and maybe also the only component that is needed to drive the project forward. I don't know. One of the reviews I like most in the entirety of my life as an artist was written by Holland Cotter. So this is Holland Cotter in the New York Times, referring again to the exhibition of CHBC at Sculpture Center. This is 2017. In short, the project, de-exoticizing and re-exoticizing, is politically problematic on almost every level, and it's fascinating for that reason. It raises questions about imbalances of power based on race and class that are at the very foundation of modern Western culture, but that our big museums have resolutely refused to address, never mind to answer. Now, why I like the quote so much is that it, to me anyway, it pays justice to the project not only bringing up those questions, like, there's colonialism, there's racism, there's violence, there's capitalism, basically, and it's terrible. It does that. I think the show in Sculpture Center did all of that. And that would be enough for it to be a good decolonial show. But it also, on top of that, made it really difficult to accept at face value for many Western audiences as proper decolonial critique, because it situates the critique in the here and in the now, and in present production chains. So the colonial and the critique of the colonial is not situated in something in the past or something situated outside of the realm of daily consumption. On the contrary, it does also do it in the past and also situates the critique, the realities and the critique thereof, in the here and the now, in the daily consumption of chocolate, but then also in the daily consumption, if you will, of critique of the
Yeah.
colonial realities. Now, I think that happens in that exhibition in Sculpture Center, and part of why it happens is that the sculptures that are about histories on the plantation and how horrible they are, and they are about future visions of the plantation and what could happen if things go better. But all of this reproduced in chocolate, which again is a product that we consume daily from plantations like these and others. So one way of reading it, I'm not saying it's the only one, is that it is all a consumption article. But you know what? If we consume enough of it, people will be able to buy back their land and plant forests. So it's a little bit it's a little bit more multidimensional than simply saying that the colony was a bad thing. Of course it was a bad thing. That capitalism is bad. Yes, of course it's bad. At least for many, many, many people. It's terrible. And for some people it's not so terrible. But for many people it's really terrible. And that you should make shows about it. Yes, you should make shows about it. And that these shows should maybe like shape opinion. Sure, they should shape opinion, and that maybe some of them can be redistributed so that people, the subject of those shows, can actually also benefit from the world decolonizing. Yes, that too. But then on top of that, that this is also part of a consumption pattern, and that the question is who benefits from that consumption pattern. So I think in a different way than in Enjoy Poverty, obviously, because I didn't make the sculptures, other people did. But I think some of the same multidimensional readings are present in the work, which makes it really hard. You know, the Holland Cotter review I like because he acknowledges and points and validates these different aspects to those sculptures. But quite a few people do not do that. You know, we were not invited for the Venice Biennial, and also CATPC was not invited for Documenta. So because it doesn't quite does the thing that it needs to be doing in this present moment, and I think for good reason. We avoid, or I mean, I don't know, we don't avoid it. I would have loved the sculpture to be part of Documenta, but they would have done something slightly differently than some of the other works that I saw there.
Yeah. Well, Renzo, thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to maybe take 1 minute to hopefully plug your latest project. You very recently, with Certipese, released an NFT rendering of a sculpture of a Belgian officer called Ballot, who I think was killed in an uprising at the plantation in 1931. The
Yes.
sculpture itself was made